Great. So good morning. Good morning. I think you're ready to get this program underway. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to MoMA this morning. My name is Peter Reed. I see many familiar faces in the audience. I'm Senior Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs here at MoMA. Glenn Lowry is traveling today, otherwise he would probably be standing here and eagerly welcoming a lot of former colleagues and friends to MoMA. So we're really thrilled that you're here at MoMA today and happy to host AAMC during its annual meeting. And I think it's particularly fitting, I suppose, that this particular symposium, which participation, engagement, and the curator, is taking place here. I mean, it's a topic of keen interest in museums around the world, and it's certainly caught our attention and imaginations and so forth in the various programs that we're doing. At MoMA, much of the research about visitor experience and the program development demands really keen cross-departmental conversation, cooperation, and planning. And it's, at MoMA anyways, I just want to recognize a few colleagues who are leading many of these efforts. Wendy Woon, Director of Education, and I see Wendy standing back there. Wendy, maybe just wave so people see you. Next to Wendy is Pablo Helgera, also head of adult and academic programs at MoMA and a performance artist in his own right. And they work very closely with our colleagues in digital media, led by Allegra Burnett, and they work with all of the curators. And I'll just mention one of them in particular. I think of Paula Antonelli, who's sort of often looking at the forefront of ideas in her role as not only curator, senior curator of architecture and design, but she has another title here. Half her time is as a director of research and development, which was really an effort to say just time to think and look ahead and to think about such topics as and an AAMC board member and a graduate of the what we call the Buffy program and and so forth, but a great colleague. And it's these various experiments and seed projects, you might say, that Wendy and colleagues have initiated over the years that have really sparked a lot of keen interest in ideas, whether they are rogue gallery guides that accost our visitors and initiate unexpected conversations, or the Alzheimer's program, which has now blossomed around the world with different kinds of access to artist-led interventions, to live streaming, to artists doing things in the cafe, whatever. It's a different kind of place. And yet we still reserve time, even now that we're open 7 days a week, still reserve time for such things as Scholars' Days, where scholars and art historians from area universities and other museums and conservators can spend time, quiet time, in the galleries, in the conservation lab, and so forth. But it's really managing this whole matrix of activities that is a challenge and also really, really thrilling. Sally asked if I would just say a few things about what's on view, because if you take a break today, the galleries are open. As I said, we're now open 7 days a week. It's one way we're responding to the rather crushing demand of nearly 3 million visitors a year in this relatively small museum. But some of the shows that are on view right now, up on the 6th floor, a special exhibition, Claes Oldenburg, the Street and the Shop, the Street and the Store, which is organized by MUMAC in Vienna with Ann Temkin and Paulina Paboja here in the Painting and Sculpture Department. Really interesting work. It focuses on Oldenburg's early work around 1960-61, the Street and the Shop. Just as he's inventing the big overstuffed hamburgers and ice cream cones that we're familiar with, this is a rather gritty look at his beginnings. It's absolutely eye-opening 50 years later. And in the atrium, his Mouse Museum and the Ray Gun Wing, which are a kind of wonderful found object appropriation thing where Oldenburg himself plays as a museum director, museum curator, organizer. On the 3rd floor, 2 other temporary exhibitions. Henri Labrouste, Structure Brought to Light, organized by Barry Bergdahl, Chief Curator of Architecture and Design with colleagues from Paris. It's a sumptuous show of Labrousse drawings and models that focus on a couple of things. His 5 years in Rome, and you've just never seen such beautiful drawings. They've never been in the United States before, most of them. And then it focuses on the two great libraries in Paris, the Bibliothèque Saint-Geneviève and the Bibliothèque Nationale, which is about to become Paris's library for art history research. But these beautiful stone, steel, and glass libraries are beautiful to look at in their own right, and the way Barry's done this by looking sort of through the lens of today and the relevance of libraries and design with innovative materials and so forth is really quite eye-opening. And right next to it is, in the photography galleries, is an exhibition on Bill Brandt, called Shadow and Light. And it's just sort of a wonderful circumstance of a curator, Sarah Hermanson-Meister and Drew Sawyer, and their work in photography, Bill Brandt, structure and shadow and light, and then you got Labrousse, structure brought into light, and it's like, oh, interesting. These things just happen. But it's a beautiful, beautiful show devoted to Bill Brandt, that mid-century British photographer that looks at London before the war, London during the war, and then a whole body of work based on the nudes. On the second floor, another temporary exhibition drawn largely from the collection by Sarah Suzuki. It's focused on Dieter Roth's prints, multiples, and artist books. It's called Wait, Later This Will Be Nothing. And it's one of the most imaginative uses of materials and ground up paper, and the whole notion of what a book and a multiple is quite eye-opening and really fun and really lively. And then if you walk through the rest of the museum, the collection galleries, the contemporary galleries, the prints, drawings, architecture, design, what's astonishing for me as I look around at the museum right now is how many recent acquisitions are on view in these galleries. And I mention that because it's a way, if you want to say, what are the MoMA curators up to these days? What are they collecting? Just take a look at the galleries. We rotate them a lot, and there's just a lot of new work that's both contemporary but also historic that has been added to the collection in the last year or two that's now on view. And lastly, I would mention up on the 4th and 5th floors is the most recent iteration of the Artist Choice series. And that's where, in this case, Laura Hoffman in the Painting and Sculpture Department invited the artist Tricia Donnelly to examine MoMA's collection and make a selection, artist choice, and install it. And what you'll find on the 4th and 5th floors is how Donnelly has sort of interrupted, you might say, the flow of the chronological flow of painting and sculpture, and suddenly you'll be in the Futurist Gallery, and then next to it is a surprise. You walk in and it's a whole room devoted to Elliot Porter's nature photography of birds. Elliot Porter finally got his day. It's great. And I love the juxtaposition with futurism of birds in flight, and it's kind of wonderful. And as you walk through those galleries, you'll see the other kind of juxtapositions that Donnelly's made. So that's a snapshot of what's on view. I know you're anxious to get to the program today. Again, it was my pleasure just to say welcome, and I look forward to seeing you around later. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katherine Evans, and it's my pleasure to thank Peter Reed and MoMA and the incredibly bright IT staff here, and to also thank Skinner's Auctioneers for caffeinating us this morning. It's really a pleasure to be here at MoMA. This is where I cut my teeth, first 10 years of my career. So we're actually in a theater that I worked at the middle-sized MoMA, so this is a space I know well. Today, we have these wonderful panelists. I'm going to lay out a little bit about how we're going to proceed this morning, but start by saying that yesterday in Julian's panel, he offered a range of ideas and institutional approaches to museum as civic platform, as for community engagement, and we heard also about collaborative models for conservation and partnerships within museums. Peter just spoke about cross-departmental teamwork. Today we're going to bring 4 new voices to the discussion. No curators were hurt in the assembly of this panel. We'll hear from each of them. Correct? Briefly about their vision and what they bring to the table. And in the spirit of participation, I hope we'll then move into some conversation with you all. What I learned yesterday, and even today, just with Peter's remarks, is that whether you're a middle to small non-destination museum in a non-destination city, like Columbus, Ohio, or a major museum in a major city, each of us is grappling to various extents and with varying degrees with the redefining the museum role and our function as curators within it. Here are our panelists. I refer you to pages 5 and 6 in your packet for their bios. I won't go through that right now. Just to start things off, I'm going to show a few slides about our story at the Columbus Museum of Art. I think we can go to the next slide. Some of you might be familiar with this, again, dovetailing onto Peter's remarks about libraries. This was a study from the IMLS back in 2009, and I think it really captures, can you animate that sub? Oh, thank you. Already done. Really highlights some of the concerns that we're addressing, some of the challenges when we go from the 20th century learner to the 21st century. And for us, it was a great way to frame some of our initiatives, to keep thinking back to what is it that we are trying to achieve and how are we going to do that. The next slide is just, we started with very small steps back in about 2003, 3 and 4. We did an exhibition. We took the Egypt treasures from the Brooklyn Museum exhibition. We were the second venue. And on the left there, we started to rethink how we created spaces for visitors, not just the traditional kind of reading room at the end, but how could we kind of pause the visitor as they experienced the exhibition in comfortable, intuitive ways. And of course, we had great support from Brooklyn, so that in and of itself was an interesting way to reimagine a presentation. It went on to 2 other venues, and those venues followed our lead, in fact, bought our furniture. It was all a win-win. Just to end, when we were thinking about our reinstallation just a few years ago, we really wanted to organically try a number of different initiatives, and it was really not, a brand new branding kind of thing. It was quite subtle, and for example, on the left, this is in our Old Master Gallery, we did a Madonna and Child wall, and we asked visitors, we just had a very simple station, rather discreet, I think. We had a big discussion about how high that station should be, where visitors could say, vote for their favorite image that best for them depicted the mother and child relationship. And that, again, really got to our objectives of close looking, critical thinking, sparking conversations with strangers, having the social group that we know comes to museums interact in a way by looking at the art. And just to reassure everyone, this is a recent acquisition by Alison Rossiter, a photograph that I just installed in a gallery with really just the more standard wall text. And so my point being that For us, it's been a hybrid process. It's not been a complete, I don't know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we've been doing. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Nina Simon, for whom it's 3 hours earlier.
Can we see me for a sec?
Hello, Nina?
Yeah, can we go to the video for a sec so I can see people can just see me for a sec?
This is Nina Simon.
Yeah.
Nina has graciously agreed to join us from Santa Cruz, and so we're delighted to have you, Nina. I can't see. It's not working. Nina's going to present.
Thank you.
There you are.
Okay, great. Well, I really apologize to everybody that I can't be there in New York, and I'm going to keep this fairly short, and I'm happy for us to switch back to the slides. I'll come back on video when we go to the discussion part of this, this session. So Katherine asked me to speak sort of about some of the basics around looking at what participatory practice can look like in museums. As probably many of you know, I wrote a book that came out in 2010 called The Participatory Museum, and have spent a lot of time both as an exhibit designer and as a researcher looking at different ways that museums and other kinds of institutions are taking on this kind of work. I'm now the executive director of a small museum here in Santa Cruz, California, and we really are I would say there is a somewhat hybrid model here, but we're also taking fairly aggressive steps to really embed participation into everything we do. So going back to the slides, if you go to the next slide, for me, the core difference when we think about participatory practice is this: going away from this idea of a traditional institution that creates really high quality content and pushes it out indiscriminately to everybody who comes, and switching to, Seb, if you go, thank you, switching to a model where we really see the institution instead as a platform that mediates relationships and information sharing among people. There's no question that it is easier and more clear to be on the traditional side of this than the participatory side of this. It allows us to really focus on just consistency and quality as opposed to on mediating relationships. But I would argue that there are actually a lot of benefits to being on this platform side, at least in some of the projects that we do. One of the ways I like to think about this is as a kind of negotiated agency, that every visitor who walks in the museum brings their own expectations, their own experience with them, and we're constantly in a negotiation with them anyway about what they're going to see and how they're going to engage. And so I think about this participatory platform approach as one that acknowledges that negotiation and really tries to create a framework for it. At the same time, I really don't believe that participation is for everything that happens across the museum. Like any design tool, I think it does a few things really specifically well, and particularly these 5 things. Delivering personal relevance. So for people who say the museum doesn't reflect who I am or my story, a participatory experience that incorporates visitors' voices, for example, or even just has curators signing their names to labels, which is something that happens at my museum, can help make that connection. Networking diverse voices. You know, we've focused for so long on trying to create one voice of authority in museums, but we know that there are lots of stories and objects for which that is just not appropriate. And by inviting participation, whether that's by collaborating behind the scenes or by inviting visitors to be part of that, we can really open up the dialogue about the meaning of the objects that we work with. Delivering dynamic content. You know, one of the complaints we often hear about museums is that they never change. You know, I was there 5 years ago, I don't need to go back. By incorporating participation, you can work with visitors for them to be an engine of generating new content that's changing over time. And then the last 2 of these, I would say, are more specific to an institution that might have a particular goal, either around interpersonal dialogue or around collaborative and creative practice. And again, I definitely acknowledge that not every institution has these goals as core to their institution, but they probably have some number of these goals or the problems associated with them that they might want to alleviate or ameliorate with some of their projects. Now, I just want to acknowledge, and Seb, if you can go to the next slide, that participation in museums is not always a winning concept. I was walking through the Auckland Museum with their director in New Zealand, and she points to this comic book and she says, "See, Nina, this is what happens when we let people participate. You know, this is not very interesting. This is not adding to the dialogue around this object. This is just people saying they were here." And I agree with that. But I also look at this book and I say to myself, what is this book designed for? It sort of looks like the kind of book you use to sign in at a hotel or maybe at a funeral or something. It does not look like it's in any way designed to really invite you to bring forward your best self. And I think for me, there are so many examples and so many design concepts we can use to really think critically about not how do we invite people to participate, but how do we design structures that really create opportunities for people to help make what we do better and to really contribute something meaningful to the experience. So I just want to share 3 examples of that with you this morning. The first example is from the Denver Art Museum, and this is from an exhibition they did a few years ago. They had a formal show of psychedelic rock and roll posters, and then next to it they created this space called Side Trip. It was designed to feel like a den or in a basement, and one of the primary activities in there was you were able to make your own poster. Now, what was really interesting about this project is that they didn't just give people blank pieces of paper and markers and say, go make your own poster. Instead, what they did is they took icons and images from the actual posters on display in the gallery, and they turned those into transparency sheets. And they gave people clipboards, and so you could take all these different symbols from the real posters, put them together on a clipboard, add some of your own elements with a marker, and then you take it over to somebody at a color copier and they would Xerox a flat image for you. So it's a physical mashup of the posters in the exhibit plus your own creativity. And you can see at the bottom of this slide some of the results of what happened here. This was not a grab and go activity for kids. A large percentage of the people who came to the exhibition made posters, and they spent a long time on these posters. And I would argue that this creative activity is not just a plaything that accompanies or distracts even from the exhibition, but is one that really invited people to get engaged with the artifacts on display next door, to personalize them, and to ignite their own creativity through and with the artifacts on display. Now, the next example I have is from a tiny institution. This is an example of really trying to create a dynamic life around objects by using participation. This is a story from the Worcester City Gallery and Museum. This is in England. It's a very small museum that's actually on the 2nd floor of a library. And they decided a few years ago that they wanted to create an exhibition that would really bring visitors back again and again throughout its run over the summer. And so they did this show that does not sound like the blockbuster sensation of the summer. It was called Top 40 Worcester's Favorite Pictures from the Collection. They hung 40 of their favorite paintings on the wall. That was it. But then what they did is they put a ballot box in the middle of the room and said, if you can go to the next slide, we'll see one of these ballots. And they invited people to vote for the painting that they liked most to go higher in the top 40 countdown the following week. And you could have an art historical argument why, or you could just say, I like it because it's pretty. It doesn't matter. One ballot, one vote. And then what would happen is on Friday evenings, at the end of the week, the staff would take the ballots, count them up, and they would move around these labels. So if you go to the next slide, we'll lose the ballot, and you'll be able to see, if you look at the labels, there's a traditional tombstone label, but then above it, you can see this label that says 9 in the countdown of Worcester's favorite pictures. And so those number labels, they would literally move around every week based on what happened with the ballots. And they said they knew this was working when there were people who were lined up outside the museum, actually the library, on Saturday morning to come in and see how the numbers had changed. That people, and again, this is British people, would stand in front of their favorite painting, up other visitors, and try and encourage them to vote for them. I know there have been many museums that have done voting projects. The Walker did their 50-50 print project recently. One of the things I think is really interesting about this project in Worcester is that it's not the voting that makes this a really successful project in terms of bringing people back again and again. You could imagine they could have said, in the beginning of the summer, we're going to let you vote to come up with this top 40 list, and we're going to collect votes all summer, and then we will release the list at the end of the summer. in that case, which is sort of what the walker did, you would come twice. You'd come once to vote, and you'd come once to see how it ended up. But in this case, instead, the museum was saying, we're going to enter into a conversation with you about how we value this art in our community, and we're going to be continually responsive. On a weekly basis, we are going to move these signs based on what you do. So not only do you have a reason to come back to influence the outcome, but you get this sense that you're part of an ongoing dialogue as opposed to it being a one-off participatory experience. The last example I want to share is from my own museum. This is a couple of images from a project we did as part of an exhibition last fall called Santa Cruz Collects. This whole exhibition was about the why of collecting. Why do individuals collect? Why do institutions collect? And what is this all about? And we decided that in addition to the main exhibition where we really focused on people's objects, that we wanted to create a participatory space where people could share the things that we collect that are really most precious to us, which are non-material things, which are our memories, our stories. So we collected this space, we created this space. You can see to the left, there are floor-to-ceiling mason jars on shelves, and on the right, you can see we have some sand pails with materials in them. And basically the activity you could do in here, which is sort of pointed to by this mural on the wall, is take down an empty jar, fill it with a memory, bottle it up, write a label for it, and put it back on the wall. We had a huge success with this. We started with 400 jars. We ended up having to buy, I think, about 1,000 jars total over the run of this show, because it was such a popular activity. And I just want to show you one of the jars that somebody made during this time. This is from a visitor who, I'll read this in case it's hard for you to see. It's from a person named Mark, and he says, "I remember when you were alive for Iraq and open pit burns, which gave you cancer. I remember when we learned that you died in Iraq in our arms at home. I miss you, I miss you." I don't think this visitor walked into our museum that day thinking he was going to share this story. But I do think that what happened was that this participatory activity, the way it was framed, the way we thought about the design of it to respect what these visitors had to offer, the way we thought about what the materials would be and how it would connect to the exhibition, that all of these things pulled out of him something really powerful to share with other visitors. You know, I agree with that museum director in Auckland who says that knowing that Mark was here, Tatiana was here, is not useful participation. But I also believe that when we design these frameworks in a way that really respects the power of what visitors have to offer, that they can contribute amazing things. They can contribute to the overall experience and power of what we offer as a museum. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and happy to talk later about whatever questions or disagreements people have. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. We love your virtual presence. Next up is Kathy Mclean, and Kathy.
Thanks, Nina, and thank you for inviting me here to participate in this conversation, and thank you all for being here. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation after our talks. I'd like to start with a quote from an American art museum director, speaking about his new, soon-to-open museum. "It will be a laboratory in its experiments, and the public will be invited to participate." That was Alfred Barr speaking in 1929 about this Museum of Modern Art. Slide. Okay. Long before the internet changed the world, museum scholars and professionals were experimenting with and creating participatory experiences for and with museum visitors. Much of this practice came from an understanding that participation encourages engagement, stimulates the imagination, and supports the process of learning. Early interest in participatory experiences took root in children's museums and science museums, places grounded in learning theory. And for those of you who are familiar with learning theory and who acknowledge that museums are communities of learners, you recognize that participation is no lightweight idea. It's deeply embedded in the formulation and the cultivation of an aesthetic experience. Early experiments in participation also cropped up here and there in art museums, and artists provided fertile new works, like in the happenings beginning in the 50s and in the participatory art practices of the 60s and 70s. One of my favorite works during this period is Hans Heke's, and I never say his name right. Is that right? Heke? Hans Heke. Hake. Thank you. Hans Hake's MoMA pole in the 1970 exhibition Information, here again at the Museum of Modern Art. And you can see how Bruce Mau appropriated the idea in his exhibition Massive Change at the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2004. And again, here's another example of a voting activity, and we could go off into a long discussion about this whole notion of what's compelling or not about voting, but that's for another day. So, a lot of time and experiments and participatory exhibits have come and gone. But not many of us paid attention to these ideas simmering and growing over the years. Today, as we learn more about the human mind, about characteristics of the aesthetic experience, about social and civic engagement, the significance of participation becomes even more central, more essential. And where does this leave us today? Surprised, jolted awake by the power of the response, even with such a modest call. Public expectations of participation have taken root in every fertile inch of human culture, and museums are no exception. There's no going back. We've been invaded. This invasion, this participatory free-for-all, has compelled more than a few curators and scholars to hunker down, to mutter even more loudly about dumbing down, and retreat into an intellectual isolationism that undermines their ability to share their expertise more broadly. And that's a shame. And at the same time, museum marketing departments increasingly pressure us to get on the participation bandwagon. And in doing so, some of us worry that the pendulum has swung too far in the opposite direction. That participation, for its own sake, is replacing the difficult work of arts inquiry. We worry that crowdsourcing might be crowding out the aesthetic experience. Let's go back a slide. To many of you, this probably looks really messy. It looks like a mess. But I can tell you that it's also a conversation. Conversation means to keep company with, the act of living with. Conversation is the most essential of human interactions. I'm not talking about simplistic one-liners, declarations of opinion, declarations of love. Twitter and Facebook take care of that just fine. I'm talking about authentic conversation that can nourish the exchange of ideas and, with reciprocity and mutual respect, create new knowledge and insights. And conversation, I submit, is arguably the most powerful form of participation in which a museum can engage. I've been working with museum curators and designers across the country to experiment with new ways to spark and sustain generative conversations. Here, in the Is It Art Lounge at the Oakland Museum of California, we invite visitors to join curator conversations about the meanings and definitions of art. On the one hand, inspired by the classic visitor pronouncement that my granddaughter could do that, how could that be art? And then on the other hand, inspired by heated curatorial discussions about the boundaries between a native basket, a specimen of bunch grass, and a contemporary wire bowl. We have tried to take the most interesting conversations among museum staff and bring them into the public arena. Our fundamental intention goes deeper than that, to the exploration of generative questions. Questions like, I wonder what happens if, why is it that most museum exhibitions and high-profile programs grow out of curator-driven questions? Curators determine the scope of inquiry and the parameters of content, and disciplinary boundaries abide. Art museum curators determine content about art. History museum curators determine content about history. And the scope can be very tightly focused, particularly when curators think of exhibitions as their opportunity to create three-dimensional monologues or monographs. This is not to say that we should abandon scholarship and expertise. At the same time that visitors expect to engage more actively in their museum experiences, they also expect and want to hear from museum experts. And I've done a lot of research in this realm, and it is true over and over and over again at all different kinds of museums. Visitors want to know what the experts think, why experts value some ideas and objects over others, and how that expertise can help them make meaning and make sense of the world, find significance in the world around them, or at least at the museum. We need to embrace the contributions of expert knowledge and at the same time expand our definitions of expert and expertise to include broader domains of experience. In Santa Fe, at the Museum of International Folk Art, in their new Gallery of Conscience, we are prototyping Let's Talk About This. Folk artists speak out about HIV/AIDS. With honest conversation and thoughtful participation among visitors, curators, other museum staff, scholars, community members, and folk artists around the world, the exhibition is evolving over time. For me, it is surprising, thought-provoking, energizing, and challenging, the qualities that I love in a good exhibition. The issue isn't whether we should provide opportunities for people to choreograph their experiences in museums. It's how we embrace these opportunities ourselves. We need to consider new roles for visitors as they engage more actively in our programs and exhibitions. Rather than perceiving visitors as novices, we would do well to consider them scholars in the ancient and best sense of the word, I believe. People who engage in study and learning for the love of it. We need to find ways to bring the museum's expert knowledge into conversation with people who attend our museums, people who bring with them their own expert knowledge. And this means letting go of the notion that we, museum professionals, are a class apart from our visitors. And we need to find new ways to create narratives in common, narratives that will change over time as the world around us changes. As the news each day reminds us, these are not always easy or comfortable conversations, but they situate museums at the center of public discourse, and they breathe new life into our museums. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Now we have Tina Olsen, Director of the Williams College Museum of Art in Williamstown, Massachusetts.
Good morning. I am in the process of going paperless. This is my first attempt to deliver a talk from my iPad, so we'll see how it goes. So I have 5 minutes, yes, to talk a little bit about participatory culture and the academy, and in particular academic art museums. So I thought what I would do is I would talk about some of what I think is facing the academy, and then loop around to show a couple of examples of things happening in academic museums, and then speculate a little bit at the end, and then hopefully in the questions too about the potential, or sort of where that leaves us. So I'm going to start with a kind of ugly diagram, and you'll just have to forgive me for this. I borrowed this from an article by Randy Bass in EDUCAUSE Review, publication, some of you may know it, covers a lot of higher ed issues. And I'm showing it because I think we all know, you all have probably heard a lot of what is happening in the academy and a lot of the sort of trends and pressures that the academy is under. So on the one hand, there is this kind of growing body of data about the power of experiential learning. And this is all actually something we all probably know because, in a way, we're all crafters of experiential learning, right? Learning that happens outside the classroom. But a lot of that data has really shown that in colleges and universities, that domain of things, and I'm thinking about things like going abroad and community service and service learning and internships, is in fact where you see the highest correlation with holding on to students. So there's a really intense correlation between retention, graduation, and the depth and quantity of those experiences, much higher than a correlation with coursework, right? And so colleges and universities are taking stock of this and doing some real head scratching, like what does that mean? How do we take advantage of that? How do we leverage it? So we've got that whole pressure on the one hand. And then on the other, of course, there is everything that we've been talking about today and yesterday, which is all of these new forms and models of informal learning and participatory culture. And so that's all of the stuff that you're hearing about MOOCs, these massive open online courses, and lots of questions about the relevance of a really, really expensive college education in the face of all these other forms and kinds of learning. Can I have the next slide, please? So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, and I'm showing you a slide from the website Smart History. How many of you all know about Smart History and use it, or at least have taken a look at it? Okay, so a good chunk of the audience. So Smart History isn't a MOOC, at least yet, but it's an interesting talking point, I think, in terms of this changing world of the academy and museums vis-a-vis participatory culture and informal learning especially. So it's the work of a pair of really enterprising art historians who years ago were working in higher ed, teaching art history mostly to a very diverse body of students, and were really frustrated with the Jansons, with the art history textbook, and their students were too. And so they began producing these short, self-made conversations between them, mostly between them, in museums all over New York, and then publishing these at first to a blog and then eventually to a website. And their students loved them. They produced more and more. They eventually quit their jobs to work on this site, and now they have thousands of videos, mostly produced by them, but some by others. And they have been incorporated now into Khan Academy. And Khan Academy is sort of a MOOC. I think you could probably argue that it is, although it's mostly free. But they offer all kinds of mostly video-based content in the sciences, beginning to now in the humanities too, Smart History being their first foray there. So why am I bringing them up? I think because what they did helps us to see some really important things, right? That the content, the deep information, and the stories that museums hold in the form of their collections are highly valuable and of deep interest to a hungry and global public. But also that the museum's walls, where that content, where those collections reside physically, arguably matters less and less, right? So it's the commingling of this content and these stories from across an aggregation of museums, which is what Smart History is leveraging and why they have taken off. And also, I think that the museum's objects and the vast stories they generate will take many, 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 many more forms beyond the forms that we all have been kind of traditionally trained to deliver, which is exhibitions. Next slide. So that's outside the academy. What's happening inside it, or at least what's happening inside college and university art museums? I'm showing you an example of a college art museum that really embraced participatory culture in both content and form in the exhibition Feast, which was curated by Stephanie Smith at the SMART, which is University of Chicago's College Art Museum. University Art Museum. So Feast surveyed artistic practices that were centered on food and eating in the 20th century, and to do justice to that content, to that topic, it couldn't take a traditional exhibition form. So it happened in the galleries, it happened in the form of events, it happened in the form of programs that unfolded over the run of the show, inside and outside the museum. So it wasn't simply a set of participatory practices that were sort of globbed on to an exhibition, but a real rethinking of form, if you will. And then finally, next slide, please. An example of not a college art museum, but a museum that was experimenting with the culture's excitement about informal learning and using its spaces to do that in a really profound way. And this is the Hayward Gallery in London, and a couple of years ago it launched Wide Open School. So the Hayward turned the entire gallery into a school, and they invited artists to craft courses and classes, and they called it a school for people who love learning but do not necessarily like schools. People explored subjects that they were curious about, and students weren't taught in any kind of conventional sense. So Wide Open School was open to everyone. There was no application, there was no entrance exam, there was no enrollment. It was first come, first serve. It took place in classrooms built into the Hayward's gallery spaces. So it wasn't an exhibition, right? It demanded a very different type of engagement and took a very different form, but nonetheless within the conventional form of the museum. So I think it's a pretty interesting mashup, and it got me really thinking. So quick summary, and I'm probably over my time here. I think all of this bodes incredibly well for the academic museum, and I think so because it truly is the place where formal education meets informal education, where learning happens from objects, around objects, with objects, from experiences the public has outside of the classroom, and it can act as a kind of hinge or a door, if you will, between what's inside and outside the academy. It could also be a place where a lot of the experimentation that we're talking about today takes place, because we've got no gate most of the time. We've got this young public, digital natives all around us that are our primary public. So I think that's really rich and really exciting. But I think for that to be realized, college museums have to think really creatively about the forms that build around exhibitions. So the things that Katherine described, that Nina described, programs, things happening outside museums and inside them, things happening online. So it requires thinking of themselves as learning sites, student and public centered, and not as teaching sites. So that whole language, that whole verbiage around the teaching museum, we may see that evolving away from. We may not be teaching museums, we may be learning museums over the next decade or more. I think it also probably requires an expanded notion of what a curator exclusively is and does, but I'm going to leave that point to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we have Seb Chan, who's the mastermind of all things digital, virtual, etc., from the Cooper Hewitt.
Hi. I'm going to give a very brief view of the last little while in technology. It'll only take about 5 hours. Technology, as you've heard, has begun to change a lot of things, and I've come to New York to the Cooper Hewitt from a background really in working with museums of other sorts and also libraries. So the Cooper Hewitt's renovating at the moment, as you probably know, and we're taking this opportunity to really rethink and build in some of the things that technology allows us to do to enable participation at a greater scale. And this is also allowing this moment to rethink the purpose of a museum in relation to these changes that we've heard from Nina, Kathy, and Tina. What is a museum more as a network, as a node in a network rather than a single place? The objects we're preserving, collecting, and exhibiting have also begun to change, and we are starting to collect technology. So in the Cooper Hewitt collection, we have this 3D printed chair, and we know that in the MoMA collection now we have things like this, Pac-Man collected as an example of interaction design. The objects themselves are becoming digital, and these pose enormous challenges to curators beyond participatory experiences, but to the nature of things themselves. Technology for us in museums is not actually new. This is the first audio guide in a museum from 1952. It looks a lot like the iPhone, the early iPhone at least. But technology really just increases scale. It increases scale for the good things and also for the bad kind of things. And it's really important that when museums deploy technology, that they have a clear rationale around how it fits their mission. and how it can improve the ways they do the things they want to do. Technology is in the hands of our visitors, and in some kind of museums, it is quite overwhelming. And we're starting to see responses to this, not only in museums, but also in gigs. So I have a parallel life in music, and this was a piece of paper that was up at a gig by a band called the Savages, where they had put up a thing saying, please don't take out your phones during our gig because it prevents immersion in the experience. Now, how many times do we hear this in discussions of exhibit design within our own museums? But we're starting to also see that some museums are taking very bold kind of steps. So the Cleveland Museum of Art's been getting a lot of press recently about the ways they have deployed technology with their media designers' local projects to engage more diverse audiences. So here we're seeing searches of their collection by facial expression or by line and a pattern, and you'll see in a minute the ability to pose as a sculptural form. And these are ways that they can engage new audiences, but also deeply engage with works of art. And the process of this. I'll just zoom this forward a bit if I can. Let's see if this works. Look, I can control this from up on screen. This is amazing. Sorry, we've just... okay, I'm going to skip on. This a complete tech fail there. This is from a museum in Tasmania. This is a museum experience that is highly immersive. It's a private collection. It's built below the ground. It's entirely dark. And every visitor gets a mobile device that carries all the interpretive signage. There are no labels in the entire museum. And what's interesting about this is it is not only a way of delivering content and experience, it's also a way of tracking visitors to enable the museum to better design future exhibits and to allow curators to learn from the ways visitors appreciate different works of art in different ways, and then respond in the future. You'll see if I just do skip this forward. Let's see if this works. And of course, what's interesting about this is when you leave the museum, you get sent your tour. So the museum visit is not a solitary experience. It is connected to previous visits. You see the things you saw on your previous visits, as well as inspiring future visits. You get told the works you didn't see, as well as the works you did see. Kind of awesome. Anyway, so in closing, I'm just going to say that technology is allowing us to also measure success in new ways. And we have the traditional measures of success, these sorts of things for curators. These are all, very robust and important things, as Kathy has explained. We also have new ways of tracking this. We can now do citation of metrics to see how kind of frequently our scholarly works are cited. We can track sales and reader engagement around publications. The types of the things we acquire, as I've said, are beginning to change. But perhaps there are also now two other things curators are being challenged with as their measures of success. Is it also about the quality of visitor experience? And is it also about impact to a broader public? And a broader public that is now global in nature and networked. Sorry, I just had MoMA's Wi-Fi kicking me off because I've been on here for too long. Let me just jump back. There we go. So we're going to open now for questions because I think this is really about the discussion around this more than anything else.
Thanks, everyone. Those, as promised, for diverse voices from different perspectives, all thinking about the same things we're thinking about as curators. Is Nina back with us, or do we just call her up?
She is.
Hi, Nina. You're still
Hi.
with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to just start by asking for a show of hands of how many of you here today would self-identify as working in a middle-sized or small museum.
Wow.
Okay, that's fascinating. That's great that you're here, first of all. I know it's we have to be creative about how we get here with our small budgets. I wonder who wants to think about or suggest ways that if you're interested in this new model, and it seems we all should be, that you know, how do you do it? You fundraise for new initiatives. For us at Columbus, we redirected resources that we had for different things, and that's how we started in kind of very small steps with a lot of intentional outcomes in mind. If someone on the panel wants to respond, or we can open it up to the audience as well, and if so, jump in, anyone.
Repeat your question.
My question is, how do museums that don't have great resources, who don't have the crushing demand of 3 million visitors a year, wow, you know, that's a measure of success indeed. How do the most of us, I guess, who work in non-destination places or museums, grapple with this? How do we address some of these issues?
I think that we've set it up as something so different when in fact it really isn't. We live this in our personal lives. We have conversations. If we come back to thinking about conversations and participation, we participate actively in our personal lives, in our social and political lives. So it's really looking at maybe the similarities between our practice, our existing practice, the rest of our lives, and then sitting down with and doing some little experiments. I don't think it's about wholesale change, at least not in the beginning. But Seb is talking about changing everything in his museum. But most of us are confronted much more often with tight resources, not enough time, and a lot of pressure. And the notion of thinking about it as this whole new model, I think, is part of the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Nina, do you have something to say?
You know, I used to, as a consultant, work with museums on these kinds of things, and that tended to go in the mode of, we want to do a project, we raise some money, we initiate this as its own project team. But now being in a smaller place, I would say that what we do is a lot more iterative. It involves everybody in the staff, and frankly, for us, that strapped resources and that competitive environment was really part of what drove us in this direction. You know, when I took over at this small museum, we were a week away from closing our doors and had a huge financial crisis and had a real lack of relevance and connection in the community. And so when I looked at national research that was talking about how people are really creatively engaged, but are doing so in these participatory environments, whether that be maker fairs or online or in different kinds of spaces, I really felt like we had, a compelling reason from a business perspective to shift in this direction. And that's one of the reasons for us, at least, that a wholesale model shift made sense. However, I would say that I absolutely agree with Kathy that I think that it most times can and should be incremental. And I would also argue that small and mid-sized museums are much better poised to do this work than large museums are for a couple of reasons. One is there's just less siloing overall in terms of how the institution, overcoming institutional inertia to make something happen. But I think even more importantly, when it comes to participation, so much of participation is about being open to having personal interactions and relationships with visitors. And when you have 3 million people coming through, you're necessarily in a transactional mode with most of those people. You have a different kind of problem because of that scale. And so what we find here is that the fact that we're only dealing with tens of thousands of visitors a year, and on a given day might be dealing with 25 visitors, means we can really think differently about how am I going to engage each of those people who come in the door, so that I can learn from them and so that I can invite them to help make this space better. So I actually think that, and this is broader than participation, but I would say that from my perspective, small and mid-sized museums do ourselves a disservice if we focus so much on trying to professionalize to the level of the biggest institutions